Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of all of living nature, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. We are on day 3 of a 3-day program on the world of trans, which has been one of the most fascinating programs that we've had since we began Humanity Rising nearly 2 years ago. There is a wonderful exuberance in the human community right now as people all over the world begin to express a fluidity and a spectrum of expressions with regard to some of our most basic identities as gendered sexual beings that is re-quickening the human spirit and is reshaping the narrative of who we as people believe that we are as creatures of nature, as social beings, as people who, most of us for our entire lives, work out our identities in various ways and with various masks and through various shapes and sizes and expressions. So we're in a very, I would say, fertile, erotic, generative moment in the human journey. And the world of trans is at the heart of the transformation that all of us seek during this time of duress and global challenge, when we seem to be afflicted by contradictions all over the world, coming out of climate, coming out of war, coming out of society and politics and ethnicity. There is a powerful impulse of renewal. So that's what we're going to be discussing on our 3rd day here on Humanity Rising. Before we dive into that domain, let us pause, as we always do as we begin our sessions, and just take a moment to center yourself in your body. Feel your body. And if you can, just close your eyes and attune yourself with your heart for the next minute or so. Listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're all alive in this most extraordinary moment of the human journey. Thank you, everyone. I want to now welcome back Kelsey Pasha. It's a very exciting day for him. They're just launching the revised edition of Trans Body, Trans Selves. So he's very busy, and we'll be putting that link in the chat in a moment or so. But Kelsey, thank you for convening this 3-day program on the world of trans, and I turn the program over to you.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be together, and thank you, Jim, for bringing us into this morning with a meditation. It's a really lovely way to start the day. So I'm very excited to introduce you all to two of my colleagues and friends, um, Dr. Kevin Johnson and Cal Bigari. Um, Both of these folks just contribute so much to the world, are insightful, thoughtful, brilliant people. And so I'm really thankful that you're both here today, and really excited to be able to offer a space to share some experiences and maybe some resources for folks here now live and watching later. I just want to alert you in the chat. Richard, thank you, is sending out some links to the second edition of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. So I've mentioned this before, but I'm the current board president of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. Kevin is actually one of the founding board members, and just has done so much to create that organization and all the resources therein. This is the link to where you can buy the book directly from Oxford. That's where we get the biggest royalties, so that's why I'm sending you that link. It's on pre-order, but it's been shipping to folks, even though the release date is the 15th. If you want a resource for an organization that you work for, any institution that you're a part of, this I think represents not only like 5 years of work on our part, but just kind of cutting edge thought leader content related to all aspects of being a trans, gender expansive, or non-binary person. So our press release went out today, and I'm highly recommending that folks check that out. Just before we begin, and I kind of give the floor to Kevin and Cal, I want to just give us a couple of sort of boundaries or thoughtfulness about how we might ask questions today. So we've got 3 to 4 questions that we've already kind of discussed and thought about, that I think will take us maybe even into probably before 9 o'clock. I wanted to just remind folks to think about some of the language we've talked about in the last couple of days. So what kinds of words we might use to ask questions or describe what we're talking about. So we've defined transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, using words like sex assigned at birth. And I just wanted to request of folks that a lot of times when trans and gender expansive people are on panels like this, there's a lot of curiosity, and rightfully so, perhaps, about like bodies and what kinds of changes folks might have gone through as far as like medical transition, if that's something that's relevant. And I would just ask you to pause on some of those questions, and to think about like how it might feel if, I were to ask you about your genitals, or if any of us on the panel would ask you about your sex lives, right? There might be curiosity there. And wanting to be respectful with the vulnerability that we're already bringing. So if we can kind of like put a pin in those kinds of questions, there might be ways that we get at some of that curiosity. And if not, you can always email me, but I just wanted to put some sort of lines around that, because those are often questions that transgender expansive non-binary folks get, and it can feel quite invasive and a little bit hard. Lastly, I just wanted to give us some language about a little bit of what we'll be talking about. I know I mentioned this term intersectionality the first day that we were together. But intersectionality is all about our multiple layers of identity. So all of us have not only a gender, but a socioeconomic status, a sexual orientation, a race, an ethnicity, right? And all of these parts of our identity get layered together in this unique blend that can't be pulled apart. And so part of what we'll be speaking to today is how our different parts of our identities come together to create a unique experience. And so I invite you to reflect on sort of what you're hearing, how that might be different from other things that you've seen or heard about our communities. And also, as always, how might you resonate with some of what we're sharing about our gender journeys? Because you don't have to be part of the trans communities in order to have reflections on gender. Okay, so I will stop there. I'll just put questions up quickly for Cal and Kevin. So the first thing that I'd love for Cal and Kevin to do would be just to introduce yourselves in any way that you like. So anything you want to share about who you are as a person, your background, what's important to you, the kinds of work you do, your hobbies, anything like that. Folks know a little bit about me already. I'm using he, him pronouns. Please also be cognizant of Kevin and Cal's pronouns. And as questions come up, if you put those in the chat, I think Richard and Jim will be moderating that a little bit, and I'll be looking too. So when we come to kind of the open portion, we can pull from those questions. So again, welcome, Kevin and Cal. Whoever wants to pop in first, please go ahead.
Right.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I also need to say today is Transgender Day of Visibility, which I would be remiss to not mention. This is a holiday that is recognized by the White House. Funnily enough, I didn't realize they put out statements about TDOV, which is pretty cool. But I just put a link that gives you a little bit of history about Transgender Day of Visibility and why it's important. So this is a perfect day for us to be having this conversation. Sorry I interrupted you, Cal. Go ahead.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that aside. Happy Trans Day of Visibility, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I am honored to be sitting with you all and to be sitting with Kevin and Kelsey. Trans Bodies, Trans Selves is an amazing resource that I'm so grateful to have as a trans person, and I'm just really glad to be a part of this collective knowledge that's being shared out to the community. So yeah, a lot of appreciations for you. My name is Cal Bigari. I use he and him pronouns. I am calling in from Long Beach, settled Tongva land, and in Southern California. I primarily right now, my work is based with queer youth and queer adults. So on the youth side, I work with the LGBT Center Long Beach as the school liaison. So I go into schools and make sure students are feeling safe and find the areas that they need support. And offer resources and education. And then on the adult, I suppose we serve all ages. I'm the co-founder of a queer and trans focused hair salon and community space here in Long Beach called Salon Benders. And that is a space that really, if you all have been, it sounds like, have been doing some education over the past 3 days, you know that there are a lot of challenges that the community faces, and a lot is how we're perceived and how the community responds to us. And a big place that happens is when we're getting services for beauty, and the salon is a very gendered space. So this was a space that all of our stylists are trained to really be listening to what folks want and how they want to express and how they want to find euphoria in their body. So I think Kelsey just popped our website down there in the chat. I'm going to do a shameless plug. If you are drawn to giving at this point, we have a program called Give a Cut. So it's a community for community. So folks who have a little extra can provide for folks who are in need. We know our community often faces a lot of marginalization, which makes it more challenging for them to get high quality services. So we offer a pay what you can hair service. And so if you go to our website and just click on the Give a Cut link, 75% of the funds are reserved for queer and trans people of color. And yeah, we would also love to see you if any of you are coming through Long Beach. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it off to Kevin.
Thank you, Cal. So yeah, I'm Kevin Johnson. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Kelsey, and very honored to have been thought of, and happy Trans Day of Visibility. So yes, my name's Kevin. I use all pronouns, mainly he, him, or they, them, but I'll talk about pronouns in a minute. But I am an addiction psychiatrist based in Syracuse, New York, formerly the Onondaga Nation. And I work mainly in addiction, mostly at a methadone clinic, but I also have a subspecialty working with the trans and gender expansive communities here, mainly through a small gender clinic that I've been kind of working on creating with the hospital where I work, but I also have a small private practice where I see folks as well, mainly doing things like, psychotherapy, general psychiatry, letters of support for surgery, explorations in terms of medical and surgical transitions. So those are all kind of things I tend to work with, mostly adults, but sometimes adolescents as well, working with parents who are kind of trying to understand where their kids are coming from when it comes to gender expansiveness. I also, as Kelsey mentioned, a founding board member of the Trans Bodies, Trans Selves nonprofit. So the first edition came out in 2013. And so we decided to create a board to kind of carry the mission of the book in a more community-based standpoint. The primary mission was to empower trans communities. And one way in which we did it was to seek out nonprofits who may benefit from a copy of the resource for free. Because even though with the first edition we worked closely with Oxford to lower the price as much as possible, it's helpful to have it be even lower for folks who can't afford it, because that's our target audience for both the first and the second edition. And so for the second edition, in addition to being treasurer for the board, I was also the editor for the short pieces, because how the book was structured is that there are chapters, but there are about, I think, 170 short essays and poetry written by trans and non-binary folks who were really placed to increase the number of voices that are represented in the book, because that's the point of the book, is to show that there's more than one way to be trans, and there's many voices, opinions, beliefs that are encompassed within it. And it was a really fun experience. Part of it was like herding cats, but the other part was also very enriching to work with so many folks. And I think that's pretty much it in terms of my introduction.
Thank you so much, you two beautiful people, for taking time out of your day to be here. I'm just so excited to talk to you, and really, really grateful and honored that you're here. So with that, one of the central thing that we've been talking about as a group is this concept of gender in the last couple of days. So they've heard me say a lot of things about how we can think about and talk about gender. And what folks often really respond to is story, right? And knowing like what does this mean for us? I'm curious, how would you describe your gender, or maybe your gender journey, your gender kind of trajectory throughout your life, if you were talking to folks, for the first time? What are the touchstones for you, and the terms that you've used maybe to describe your gender? I know, a simple question, right?
Oh, I'm not even muted. I guess I'll go then. So I guess for me, it's been more on the journey side than a kind of realization side, and that's the thing that I've found quite important to realize when it comes to learning more about the gender, in general, because we often are exposed to this narrative of, this has been something, I've been trapped in the wrong body. And even though that is true for some folks, it's not true for everybody. And that's just as valid. So I'd say for me, it really began, I'd say, well, really from a young age in terms of dysphoria when it comes to, why. So I'm assigned male at birth. Let's put that start there. And so, part of my struggle throughout childhood was trying to mesh between what is expected of boys and what I actually wanted to do. Like, why do they have to wear pants? Why do they have to do this as opposed to that? Why do they have to date girls? Why do they have to do, et cetera, et cetera? And part of it was, growing up in a pretty chaotic environment that kind of compelled me to focus on other things, like excelling academically, working on trying to build a career, working on becoming, stable mental health wise. All of that has kind of taken precedence to gender in many ways. So the actual kind of gender focused journey didn't really start until I would say like end of college. And going forward through medical school and after residency. And part of what I think drove that was I've always been involved in trans activism, even back when I thought that I was cis, just because I'm involved in activism, period. So I also identify as a gay man. So there's that element, just because I'm so used to that identity, I kind of hold on to that one. So LGBT activism has always been a part of me, but the T never really was there. So I kind of said, well, why don't we focus more on the T and see where this goes? So I've been involved in things like panels. In the medical field, I've done lectures for my co-medical students and for patients and for colleagues. And so I kind of just was taking the activism route for a minute there. And then it kind of came to a point where I thought, okay, why am I really interested in this? What is really the driving factor here? I mean, there's a lot of driving factors. It's not the only one, but I think what helped me was the learning of more language and what different representations of gender are. Because I grew up in so I was born in Hawaii. My father's Native Hawaiian, my mother is Black, and so I've been exposed to kind of both cultures, and mostly Black culture, just because I spend more time with my mother than my father. And the thing is, as I learned more about gender in different cultures, things really opened up for me. So, for example, one gender identity that I've really resonated with as I've been reading more about this is mahu, which is basically a form of gender in Hawaiian culture that has been really a way to encompass gender identities that aren't just truly male or truly female, or genuinely male, genuinely female. And it can be seen in different ways based on who you ask on the islands. It can be seen as a third gender. It can be seen as a form of trans. It can be seen as a way of non-binary. But the main point of it is it's the way for the Hawaiian culture to encompass and conceptualize gender in their own way. Now, as what happens with most indigenous cultures is once Europeans get involved, things shift and change. Because prior to the arrival of the British, Mahus were very revered in their culture. There was a spiritual connection between, Mahu gender and the general society. Many folks who identified as Mahu were revered as like shamans in their culture. And even one of our kings of Hawaii, Kamehameha III, took a Mahu person who was assigned male at birth as their ahine, or spouse, essentially. So the marriage system in Hawaiian royal culture is really complicated. I still don't even understand all of it. But part of what led to the downfall of the respective Mahu was actually that relationship with the king. The Calvinist church didn't like that, and so it led to conflicts between the Hawaiian culture and then the Europeans and Americans that were moving in. And then it kind of led to a kind of a downfall of gender identities. Let's stick more to the Christian Western man or woman element, keep everything heterosexual as God wants it to be, and then move on from there. However, in the 80s and 90s, there's been a growing movement of those who have retained that identity and have been spreading more awareness of it. So there's actually quite a few documentaries that came out, and one of them being Kimuhina, that came out I think 2015, 2016, that talks about Mahu culture in Hawaii, but also Fa'afine in Tahiti. So there's a really wide, rich range of culture and gender with regard to that. And I identify closely with that for a number of reasons. One is, it's part of how I connect with my identity as a Hawaiian as well, because it also comes with a lot of complications, especially being an American and a Hawaiian. And if you ask any Native Hawaiian, they'll tell you that exact thing in terms of conflict and history, but also it kind of fit in terms of how I view gender within myself. It moves to why I have my pronoun label as all pronouns, just because I part of me sees gender in a very close and spiritual way, but part of me also doesn't take it that seriously, which I think is also part of the point. So for example, so my spouse is Hungarian, and so I've been doing what I like to do best, which is learn languages that are too difficult for me to understand. But one element of the Hungarian language that was really fascinating was that there's no gendered pronouns. And if you talk to anyone who is Hungarian and maybe is kind of easing into the English language, or even those who were speaking English for years, you'll notice that they switch he and she all the time because they are still trying to figure out which is the woman one, which is the male one. And for English native English speaker, I'm like, well, this person's, or why are you doing this? But it's just because there's just one pronoun for everyone, not for, and I thought that's really, really great. I wish we had that in English language, because why do we have this he and she business? So that's why I don't really put too much stack on, like, does it have to be they versus he? Most people use he when they interact with me because I have a beard and I wear pants and have short hair, sure, fine. But if they were to use any other pronoun, I wouldn't really care, to be honest with you, as long as there's respect behind that usage. That's kind of where I'm standing on those elements. I think that's it for me. I don't know how much time that took, but I'm sure that was a long explanation. Sorry, Cal.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. It's great to hear a little bit about your history as well as your origin. So yeah, I resonate with the what you shared, Kevin, about it being a journey rather than the story that we hear or see of being trapped in a body and coming to a realization. I did have, I think, points in my journey where I had realizations of, but they weren't as clear as, like, I've always known that I am a boy or something like that. So I was assigned female at birth, and similarly, I think I can see, looking back, that I had a lot of dissonance when people were telling me how to behave. But honestly, I think I just felt a sense of dis-ease going through my childhood, and it really expressed behaviorally. And, I was really had a lot of emotional challenges and couldn't really put my finger on any of it. I didn't have the language. I didn't have representation. I just knew that things didn't feel right. So it wasn't until early college when I first knowingly interacted with another transmasculine person. And he was actually my a college professor, and I was taking a sociology class, sex, bodies, and sexualities. And he asked us to write about our gender journeys, and that everyone has a gender journey. And it forced me to think about all of these things that had been kind of under the surface. And I started putting labels and names and words to these feelings, and everything kind of collapsed for a little bit there, because there was coming to a realization that was honestly really hard for me to reckon with, because I felt an urgency with it, that the more that I learned about where this dis-ease was coming from, and the more it resonated within me of, like, oh, that that's where that feeling comes from. The more I knew that I felt like I was going to have to do something about it. And that was really uncomfortable and scary. I think something that, we talk a lot about in kind of the gender 101 is like sex versus gender. But I think something that, Kevin shared so well and was also a big part of my story is like, there's this other piece of like attribution and how people see us and those pressures. And to me, it was like a balancing act of like, people saw me in one way that was really uncomfortable for me, and making any changes was going to also be uncomfortable because then I was going to have to disclose, I was going to have to navigate, I knew that medical transition was something that was important to me. I knew I couldn't put a word on like what I was. I remember saying like, I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl, but I know I want a beard. Like, I just know that I want a beard. I know that I love beards and I want a beard. And that, of course, took navigation to, it was also in a time and a place where there was a lot more hoops to jump through. And the legal system was very different. I was in the state of Colorado, which has since changed, but there are still some states that are, I'm not going to go down that bunny hole, actually. But yeah, so I did end up seeking medical care so that I could feel more comfortable in my body. But then, of course, yes, it did create discomfort in my family. So my background is very white, Christian, traditional, heterosexual, and that was a problem for my family. And we're still, 12 years later, we're still in the process of finding language and finding ways to connect with one another. So interestingly enough, I think, I found a lot of freedom and found a lot of resonance in my body and found a lot of comfort when I was able to start being seen more as I saw myself, start being able to connect with brotherhood and connect with other men and be seen as male. And it's so funny, now that I'm working with more youth, I'm feeling more fluidity come back into my world and experience, and the way that young people are just around me expressing so just like so much gender queerness and fluidity and openness, and it's really, really beautiful. And I find myself still like kind of generationally held back in this way that like it's still very like binary, and finding myself wanting to express certain things that are more feminine, but again coming into that like discomfort of how the world will perceive me. And there's something that I have gotten very, very accustomed to, walking through the world as a white man, and no one looks at me and no one questions me. And I think that's something that's really important, is like, I found this really cute denim dress that I think is going to be really comfortable and super fun. And it doesn't mean anything to me about my gender. Like, I just think that like dudes with dresses and beards are also kind of cute. Like it's an aesthetic that really works for me. But it's definitely something that would challenge my safety and comfort in the world. And it's something that like, is just really, really, really prominent. So that's I'm still on the journey. I feel like I will always be on the journey. I am open to being on the journey for the rest of my life and to continuing to listen to what is inside, and just honoring that as best as possible and making as much space for that as possible. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, I just wish that we could like hug each other and like do a little dance party. I hear so much like joy in what you both have shared, and also I really appreciate how I feel like each of you has lifted up some of the complexities of yeah, if I make one choice, then there's this whole other series of maybe struggles or conflicts. It's like a whack-a-mole of like, okay, so then there's this way that I feel more aligned, and what is society imposing on me that you know, I just hear that in so many ways in what you both have shared, and especially this piece about like safety and privilege and the impact of white supremacy on the categories that exist even. And so I'm wondering if, you know, you've already gone there, but if you want to talk even more about the ways that all of your identities kind of intersect with gender. So I've heard about a religion and race, ethnicity, culture, maybe even the geographic area piece. You know, part of to remind everyone, what I kind of hear coming through is just this reminder again that gender isn't just one thing, that it's like there's a bodily part of it that can feel really important and urgent. And there's a gender expression piece, which is like, what do I like? But the piece about how society sees us, whatever our identities are inside and however we look, is so impactful about how we move in the world, right? So I'm wondering, what other identities do you feel like you have to negotiate in order to be, you know, yourself at that moment, kind of whatever that means? And go as deeply as you like. Y'all are not talking too much. Like, it's beautiful.
I'll go ahead. I think one of the things that I've been thinking, so actually I'll start like historically at a younger age. I feel like one of the big identities did have to do with finance and religion. So a lot of my ties to my family. So my family has wealth and has a lot of connection to opportunity for me. And there was a big conflict of, if you want financial support and if you want that security, then you will not express this part of yourself. And that was based in religion. And I would also tie into like going deeper into the religion aspect. So I was originally raised Catholic, and then my parents wanted a divorce, so we moved over into the evangelical church, and I was actively a part of, you know, the like purity camps and a lot of real, what I would call indoctrination. I did have a brief and low-key encounter with some conversion therapy, and so I was receiving a lot of messages about queerness and how I was supposed to be expressing gender. I think that you know, the way that we talk about even heterosexuality is a lot of times about gender, right? It is about being you know, serving, like, I think a big theme was like being a right woman was to be in service of your man, and to be a right man was to be a provider and a protector of your woman, right? And there's a lot of messages about masculinity and femininity there. So I think that was something that I really had to navigate as a younger person. And again, just kind of had to weigh out the choices and said, like, honestly, for me, it was like, it felt like a life and death choice. It was like, this isn't about, you know, being able to have a financial security or what, because I will not make it to whatever age that I'm going to need that money in my pocket. Like, I would rather sleep in my car. I would rather, you know, not have that resource, which is why we see a lot of LGBTQ young people, especially on the street, because they are, and I was in that situation. I did actually meet this man, Kelsey, when I was living in my car in San Francisco, because I had moved. I said, I don't know where to go or what to do, but I have a car. So there's my home, and I'm gonna go to a state where I can get what I need. So I think those were some of the big identities that came in. And I think now, as I'm an older person who is in this position of being perceived as a white, usually being perceived as a cis male, I think of my identity as a business owner. So I'm the co-founder with my sweetheart, who is a Puerto Rican cisgender woman, and she's also very small. She's 4'11", and so we really oftentimes see and talk about how we're perceived when we go into spaces like, oh, this is going to be a space for you to navigate. Oh, this is going to be a space for me to navigate. Oh, this is going to be a space for us to navigate together, because it's going to get really weird, But I think that is, one of the things that really interacts with how much femininity I feel like I can express, is really oftentimes in the business world. Like, I am not taken seriously, and she, who is a powerhouse of an entrepreneur, Kelsey's shaking his head. Yeah, he knows her. Yeah, you don't mess with her. She's far more than me. But I am perceived as the powerhouse more than her, when the fact of the matter is, yeah, they've got it twisted. Anyway, those are just some things that are really like on a day-to-day basis we're interacting with, that are really deeply ingrained with my gender and other identities. So.
Thank you for sharing. It was really wonderful hearing your story of intersectionality, Cal. So thank you for being so vulnerable. And like you, in terms of parallels. So, I didn't come from a family of means, but I did have to make the choice in college of, do I want to be financially supported and be something that I didn't want to be, or do I make the decision to support myself and then have the freedom to be who I want, even if I didn't know what I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to have the freedom to do that if I chose to. Because part of the issue that kind of where that came up at that time was less gender, more sexuality related. My mother was not very accepting of anything that was not heterosexual or cisgender. And in the Black community, at least the one in which we grew up, there is a lot of emphasis on toxic masculinity and men do this, women do that. So there's kind of a rigidity there. And any deviation from that is seen as either anti-Black, seen as being white, seen as something that is kind of against the norm of what we're trying to do as a community to advance ourselves. Somehow it's a way of us going backward, which I and many people in my community know is not true, but it sometimes is the narrative that's pushed around a lot and kind of led to a lot of the divisions between me and my biological family. So I ended up making the decision to support myself. I got in college, I took several jobs to pay for things like tuition, books, and even through medical school, took out loans. So I've been financially independent since I think 17. So I've been, which, even though it kind of sucked to have to be in that position, I kind of am a little bit grateful that I knew that I was able to do it and was able to, push forward. But with that said, it also comes with other choices as well in terms of finances and also safety. like, for example, I think it's part of the reason why, I've kind of put the gender journey on hold, because it was much easier navigating the medical system, navigating being in a Midwestern and an upstate New York area as a cis male, and using the men's restroom and using the, whatever. And I think part of it was that, as I mentioned before, I don't really take gender that seriously. So it didn't bother me to use the men's restroom. And I knew that it was not a, I mean, it was, for me, it was just a place to pee. But I think what mattered more was, I couldn't really talk more about, how gender's more fluid, how I want to, go to Mac and try on these makeup things, or try to, or wear that denim dress. Except for me, it's more satin than denim, but still, that's my that's my style. So that's, so I think when it comes to that, that's why, for example, like at work and such, I stick to he him pronouns here, even though I do have the kind of the reputation of someone who works with the trans community, and but it doesn't, what doesn't come out is kind of what my identity is in this context. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, because people make their assumptions, and I kind of just go with it because I just don't have the time or energy to educate people. Maybe as much as I'd like to be on panels like this, which is great, it could be emotionally taxing to do it on a daily basis. And oftentimes, especially in my field, the focus really isn't on me, it's on the patient. So that's why I try to focus more time on is that element and that interaction, in particular. There's something else I wanted to mention too. Oh yeah. So another factor too that I didn't mention that I think it's important for you to mention is that I'm also in recovery. I've been sober 6.5 years, and part of what I think drove me to drinking drug the way that I did before I got sober was also a lot of confusion when it comes to identity, sexuality, family of origin issues. All of that I worked out in, well, still working out in therapy and in treatment, which, and also through 12-step, which has been really enlightening for me in terms of personal exploration, but also, why I did this at that time and why I'm doing this differently now. For those who aren't familiar with the 12-step program, it has 12 steps, and the steps are very similar across different 12-step programs, even though there's one for like alcohol, one for narcotics, one for cocaine, one for crystal meth, and one element of it is to create a personal inventory, where you kind of take your personality, your history, and basically write everything down on a sheet of paper, sometimes several sheets of paper. And then step 5 is where you talk to somebody else and you have to disclose that to that other person. It could be anybody, mainly your sponsor, but it could be someone who's not your sponsor. And when I did that, I felt that it was very enlightening, because I think it was the first time that I really like seriously told someone that like this is something that I am, thinking about and dealing with, when it comes to diversities of gender and pronouns, things like that. Because I think it, having a sober mind has helped me, I guess, be more kind of honest with who I am, which I think is really important. So that's why that identity is really, really important for me when it comes to this too. I think that's it. Yes.
Something that's coming up for me as hearing both of you speak is because the last question that I have is like, what do you want people to know about gender diverse communities? Just whatever that means to you. And we could have said community there as if there was one, but we know that there are many, many. Something that I'm hearing that resonates with someone in like the after chat of this program from a couple of days ago said something to me that was like, you are a scholar of your own experience. And that can be a really difficult place to be. And it's amazing that you're capable of that. And I hear that so deeply in what both of you are sharing, that there's so much self-awareness and self-knowledge, and it's for survival, right? Like I feel like one of the takeaways that I would love people to have especially in the time that we're in with all these state laws being passed and people just being so freaked out and threatened by people transitioning, whatever that means to them, is how important it is to be able to show up in ways that allow for people to express themselves authentically. And that can mean like interrupting someone when they're saying, well, girls don't do this, or boys don't do that, because those messages become so deeply ingrained. And then we're spending all of this time trying to figure out what is the essence of me, like that personal, that like fearless inventory of how do I want to live this one life that I have, and that there's courage needed. I hear courage in both of your stories, but it's also like there's material support that is needed. And so like I know folks who have privately told me, oh, I wish I could transition, and they're usually folks assigned male at birth who identify as trans feminine or maybe as trans women, and they're like, it isn't possible for me. I would lose everything. I couldn't give up what I have now. And so that material support is so important too. So I would love to hear from your perspectives, and let me know if like that, if kind of what I pulled out of that doesn't resonate with you either. I wanted to just make the point that I really think that trans and gender expansive people, we have such a complex, nuanced understanding of our identities. And then to be in a world where people mix up sexuality and gender, and there's just all these very simplistic myths that's like, if you knew the existential depth of the process that it takes, right, to be yourself, I mean, it would change everything. So what do you most want the world to know about our communities? And what do you most want to see like in the world related to that?
I guess I could go first. So this is me putting my psychiatrist hat on, but when it comes to support and well, mainly support, it's not a secret that the rates of suicide are very, very high in the trans community, particularly among teenagers. The most recent data suggests a suicide rate that is 7 times higher than that of the general population. However, one factor, because they study, suicides is something that's been studied in depth for decades among all populations. And one factor that comes out a lot in terms of protective factors is family protection. So the more family protection a youth has, the less likely they are to either have suicidal ideation or attempt suicide. And I think that's very, very important because because I speak with parents about this sometimes, and many of them are genuinely concerned about their kids. If they wear a dress, they'll be made fun of in school. We have to encourage them to use this pronoun because it's just going to be a phase, or, the psychologist said this as opposed to that. And one thing that I try to communicate to parents, and there's different ways of doing this, is the element of support is very, very important. And even if let's say that it is a phase, the fact that you're supporting them through that phase is way more important than trying to coax them out of that phase. Because if you think about it, kids go through phases of all sorts, right? Like I went through a phase where I ate Cinnamon Toast Crunch all the time, then a phase where I would, have this blankie with me all the time, right? My mom didn't convince me to not eat cinnamon. Well, she kind of did, but still, I mean, there's that element of phases that we all go through growing up. And gender could be no different from that, and I have friends who I grew up with who did go through phases where they were messing with their gender expression, playing around with things, but then ended up being cis, and that was fine. But the key element here is support. Just one story that I heard from a parent of a trans kid was just trying to explore their gender. The kid told their parent and me and the psychologist who was working with us that they wanted to use the pronoun Superman. Now that was the pronoun they wanted to do. They were like 7 or 8 years old, and so we said, sure. Well, use the pronoun Superman, and we'll, try to see how it works. And then a few weeks later, they came back and said, you know what, I don't want that to be my pronoun anymore. It's too difficult. It's like, okay, well, sure, fine. Let's do something else. So, it's an element of support that really matters more than, is this the right thing versus not the right thing? So that's one element that I feel is really important for folks to know. Another thing too is, gender exploration. I struggle with this sometimes because, when we talk about gender exploration, we talk about trans and non-binary folks, but I think it's important to also note that cis people also go through a gender journey as well. It's not just us, and it's everybody. Not just in terms of our own expression, but in terms of society. Like 100 years ago, those who were assigned women didn't wear pants that much, compared to today, or, roles were very, very different back then. And if you go back to ancient Greece, it was a very, very different setup in terms of what gender was seen and sexuality. So, and I feel that is changing as well. I'm seeing teenagers now who are much more comfortable with fluid gender than when I was in high school, which makes me kind of jealous, but that's how it is, and that's important, just to answer some questions, because I got some really great questions in the chat. Or should I wait until the end for that? Actually, let me wait to the end, and then I'll let Cal go, then we can move on to questions after that.
Sorry, couldn't find my unmute button for a second. Yeah, so I feel like I'm essentially going to share what Kevin said, but in different words, because I feel like the biggest thing that I always want to share with people of how to be an ally is to listen and learn. And knowing that, you've heard 2 stories today. I'm sure you've heard elements of Kelsey's story. And we are just a few drops in the bucket, and every person, even if they look a lot like us, sound a lot like us, they are going to have different experiences, different needs, different desires, and support is going to look different for each person. So listen, and I think that some of the ways that I like to show support is mirroring language. So I use the language that people use about themselves, about their experience, to affirm their experience. I know and believe and trust that the person that knows them, that the person that knows me best is me, and the person that knows you best is you. And I honor that, right? And just like Kevin was saying, like, listen and respond, right? Someone will tell you, if you develop trust with someone, they'll tell you what they need and how they want to be supported. And then I think the other element of that is to know yourself, and know your limits. So I think one thing that I see is challenging sometimes for people who are trying to be allies, trying to act as allies, is they may be stepping outside of something that they are able to do. I don't know how to say this. I don't know exactly how to say this. And it's going to be a practice. So just be patient with me for a moment, as like just listening and responding can be enough. And you don't have to create something new, or, go. Yeah, I'm not sure how to say this properly, and maybe it'll get picked up by one of you, because I think you've probably seen what I'm trying to say. Folks trying to do something, they see something as a problem, and you haven't been asked to to do this thing, and it may not be needed. So anyway, y'all are nodding, and you're gonna help me out later, and you can pick up where I'm. Yes, savior complex, right? Where like I know someone who is amazing at immigration issues, and then she met a trans person and heard that story and was like, I'm gonna start a trans homeless, like what, and just went way outside of her expertise. And like that was not needed, right? And oftentimes does damage in the process when like just lean in and be a supportive person to that one person that you connected with, great. And if other people come to you, listen, but you don't need to create something new just because you feel like, oh, wow, these people are wonderful and need services. Yes, we are, as are many other people. Anyway, I have digressed way too far. Thank you for summing it up beautifully there for me, Kevin. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Cal, because just a few more comments on the savior complex. I deal with that all the time, just in my field, because the thing with savior complexes that come up is not that we don't want your help or we don't want you to do anything. It's not anything like that at all. Part of the challenge with the savior complex is that the person in the majority who tries to help out the minority, it's oftentimes becomes more about the person who's doing the help than about the actual help that's being done, if that makes any sense. A lot of that is subconscious, though. Yep, exactly. With that's also another, and toxic masculinity as well, which I digress with that. But this reminds me of I don't know if anyone's watched the show Parks and Rec, but it's actually one of my favorite shows. But there is an episode where one of the primary characters is pregnant, and her partner, listens to her, and when she says, "Oh, my ankles are swelling," like, "Oh, I'm having stretch marks," he comes up with all these solutions to solve it. And then she gets fed up and says, "You know what? I don't want solutions. I just want to complain. I just want to bitch." And he says, "Okay, that's fine." So he sits there and listens, and that's fine. And when it comes to listening and responding, sometimes the response is sometimes even optional. Sometimes just listening and being there is enough. And I notice that for a lot of folks who are trying to learn to be comfortable with uncomfortability, is when they hear stories like, "Well, let's just try to find a way to fix it right away," or like, "Well, let's look at the bright side, let's do this," which I know is done from a place of good and from help, but can come up as invalidating. So that's a very complex thing to navigate in many ways. But I guess the key element here is listen.
Yeah, so I love that. I'm really glad that we're talking about this. One thing that I would invite folks to think about within that is just the concept of privilege, right? So anytime that like we're viewing, because I find that sometimes people view the trans community as like, oh, it's this like pitiful, like, oh my God, they're struggling so hard, like, oh, they have no power, right? It's a very disempowering kind of gaze, right, at the trans community, where like I think that trans communities do amazing shit, and like we have our own like fundraising streams, and like Trans Bodies, Trans Selves is a community-led trans project. And so maybe a concrete example, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, Kevin, but let's say like in the process of talking about the book, right, like a cis person is like, what you really need is XYZ, and actually I can help you with this. And it's like, oh, we didn't ask for your help. And this is coming from a perspective of like me as the cis person who perceives myself to have more power in publishing or like whatever it is. Let me give you unsolicited advice in this area, right? It's invalidating, and it's actually not accurate to like what we're doing. And I think that that's a really key piece, especially in positions of like professional power, because I would agree with kind of what I heard Cal originally saying was that some of the worst damage that I've seen between like providers and trans people is a provider who isn't listening, but they're thinking about their own, like, let me start my task force, rather than like, how can I support this person in this situation with the tools I already have? Like, I don't have to like go through a month of professional training and then secure $100,000 in funding. No. just this interaction, this person. Okay, so I do see that we have some questions, and Kevin, I feel like if you saw something that popped out to you, I would go with it. So let's start there, maybe with some self-selected questions. Yeah. So I saw one. Yeah. Okay.
I was going through the chat, and thank you very much for your responses. It's been wonderful hearing your responses to everything here. And I just took out some questions that came up. One of them was, would you consider to be a two-spirit? And I think that's really important question. So two-spirit is a term that is, it's kind of similar to Mahu in that, there is but it refers more to Native American communities in North America, and like mainly the United States and Canada, or at least those lands. And so, whereas Mahu is more Hawaii specific. But the concept is very similar in that, those who are two-spirit are also, maybe considered third gender to some people or former transgender to another. Were also revered very, positively by their communities before the Europeans came. So the concept is very similar. And I think it's also a reflection of how many cultures that are non-Western have conceptualized gender in different ways. And sometimes similarities and parallels pop up, which is one of these. But that's a really great question. There's also one that I saw from earlier that I'll just read out the question. I've often noticed that some writers or speakers use the word sex when referring to the structure of society. I've often been tempted to suggest they intend to use gender in their speaking or writing. What specific explanation should be offered when saying why the word gender is to be preferred? Which is also a really good question as well. So, and I think a lot of it depends on the context. So, so from a medical standpoint, because I also teach the medical students about transgender health and the concept of sex and gender, is just to define the two and why it's important to at least keep them in mind when either working with patients or doing research. One great way of explaining it that someone explained to me when I was a college student that I explained to others is, because sex differences are also there as well. So having differences in gender doesn't eliminate the differences in sex. So for instance, if you're doing research on kidneys, there is a difference between kidneys in those who are male assigned at birth and those who are female assigned at birth. However, you can't ask a kidney if they feel more like a man or a woman because they're kidneys, right? So, and so when it comes to research and assessing differences, that's why those distinctions are very, very important. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind because there is a problem with medical research that often eliminates women, and in especially medical schools, like I think, a lot of what we learned were, based on research done on, white men, which is, it's good to do research, but I think we are such a diverse human community with genes and different hormones that research needs to be done on as many people as possible to get as much perspective as possible. And differences in sex is also part of that as well, and not just XX and XY, but also XXY. Because sex also has quite a few variations in nature that's more than just man and woman. That's a long answer. I hope that answers the question. But I guess I don't know what field you're talking about. So I guess if you're talking about a field and another element, something along those lines could be helpful or important. With that said, I do see things used interchangeably, sex and gender, and I think a lot of it's also the intention behind why they're being used. So if someone's using it in a way where they are obviously not understanding the difference between the two, then it would make sense. But sometimes it kind of pops out there, and what they really mean is this, so that's another element to its intention. And then do y'all have any feedback for that question before I continue?
I find that to be a really complicated question because I think sex and gender have been used interchangeably, and often what folks say is like sex is biological, gender is social. But because of what you just said, Kevin, and we reviewed this as a group on Tuesday too, the whole point of assigned at birth is the idea that, there's still human interpretation of a body. You know what I mean? So there are distinctions, and there are folks that fit in between. So I've always struggled with that a little bit, because I also think sex is constructed to a degree, right? But I don't know, maybe a quicker way would be to say gender, social, sexes, bodily. I also saw a question about a spiritual journey. And so I love this question, of course. Would you say something about how the journey towards a healthy gender identity affects a spiritual journey towards a deeper understanding of the soul? So if that resonates or not, I'm wondering if anyone can speak to that.
Can you read that one more time, Kelsey?
Can you say something about how a journey towards healthy gender identity affects a spiritual journey towards a deeper understanding of the soul? So there's sort of a statement embedded in that. So maybe we can take it up and back and just say, is there anything spiritual about your gender journey, or is there any interaction between gender and something spiritual?
That's a big question. And I think, I'm just gonna kind of share off the cuff some initial thoughts and feelings and reflections. I shared a lot about conflict with religion. And I, don't want to conflate religion and spirituality. And I think that there are ways that religious teachings pulled me away from myself. And I think that that's something that I'm trying to come back into, is relationship with myself and understanding of myself. And that is with my spirit, right? That my divine self, or my true self, is my spiritual self. And I like to see the ways that is also connected to being connected with my body and my mind and my whole self, right? So a healthy, I would say a healthy gender identity would be one that's integrated for me, and that it has been and will continue to be a practice for me to reintegrate those things that have been separated in so many ways for such a long time for the sake of survival. And I'll just share something, somewhat vulnerable here, is that there is a dissonance between my body and how I see myself, right? From my body and my mind, which is, I think, a really big piece that I'm always trying to find peace with. And that fullness of self is a really big piece of being a healthy and fully realized person. And I'm not saying that there's anything like broken about me because there's challenges. And, I think that just as cisgender people have a gender journey, everyone has challenges with their body, and everyone has pieces of their body that don't feel, perfect. So, I just think that that's a piece that's true of me. But I do, I think the last thing that I want to say, I know that Kevin mentioned how many Indigenous cultures have made the connection of queer and trans people being identified as shamans, or, as deeply spiritual people in some ways. And please add to this or provide feedback on this. But the way that I see and understand that is that they are walkers between worlds, right? And that that is kind of how we define the shaman, is that they're between the spiritual and the material world, whereas the divine feminine and masculine are being embodied in one. And I think that's something that when I make peace with that there are elements of multiple genders in me, yeah, it is a very like peaceful and spiritual reckoning that requires kind of cleaving the negative connotation from the social world and from those constructs. I don't know if that made sense, but thank you for your nods, Kelsey.
Yeah, and I apologize. I had to step out for a second to use the bathroom. The coffee goes right through me. But when it comes to spirituality and gender, I really loved your explanation, and you know, especially with the intersection between, you know, a culture and spirituality and gender. And when it comes to my experience, I think personally, part of what's been really important with regard to spirituality for me and gender is recovery. So in 12 steps, in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's often referred to as a spiritual program, not a religious program. And part of what they mean by spiritual when it comes to the recovery world is that in order to get better, in order to get sober, part of it is, accepting the need for help and acknowledging the concept that there are things outside of yourself. And that's kind of, spirituality can be talked about different ways, but in this particular element, that's kind of my understanding of it. That's helped me, because they talk about having a higher power, which, for many people is God. But for many folks, it's not God, it's just something outside of themselves that they turn to for help, because that's part of the point is you can't do this on your own, you need help. And so part of me exploring my own spirituality was coming to terms with who I am and why I was in this position where I was powerless and needed to ask for help. And part of it is also being truly honest with others and yourself. And that means also being truly honest about where you are, where I am in my spiritual journey. So that really helped me conceptualize it, but also kind of forced me to do so, because this is, part of what is really needed to keep myself healthy, and that's important too. So.
I love the question of spirituality intersecting with gender. So there's a lot I could say about that, but I don't think I need to. So I'll pause for just a moment to see did we miss any questions in the chat? Did anyone have anything that you'd like to ask Kevin, Cal?
I saw one more, and things are moving kind of quickly. So if we don't get to your question, feel free to drop it in again. I saw another one from Marie around trans people competing in sports. So that is obviously a big topic that's happening right now. And one thing that I did want to note just around language, I've heard it come up a couple of times. So a learning moment here is when we're talking about trans people, instead of, I think this one says trans competing, we leave out the people part. And so just to make sure that we're using trans as a descriptive word of people. I don't know what the grammar term for that is, but
Adjective.
Yeah, thank you. I don't necessarily want to go down a total bunny hole here, but I think the one thing that has been coming up for me in seeing all of the debates, well, two things. I think it's really frustrating to see debates about people's validity in spaces, and talking about, who has benefits, and really like, it feels like it's coming down to this, like, well, you can compete as long as you don't win. And like, I think that that's ridiculous. I think that I want to be able to see people people of all bodies competing to win because they're competitors and that's what they're trying to do. And I can't weigh in on how to do that fairly. I think that there is beautiful bodies of work from people who specialize in this, and I wish I had some direct resources at the moment, but I know there are trans athletes and advocates of trans athletics that are really working to structurally make things work. But just in general, I think that debating people's validity in spaces, especially as someone who doesn't hold that identity, is frustrating for me. And I see trans people doing it too, saying, talking about people's advantages. Well, they don't have this advantage, or they haven't won that much. And trans people haven't won that much. They haven't had the opportunity to compete. And I want them to be able to compete. And I also want them to be able to win, because everybody has different advantages. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of this is about the concept of advantage is so tricky, I think, in athletics, because if you look at the most elite athletes in the world, they have like literal bodily advantages, many of them. And so it's difficult for me. Someone like Michael Phelps, he has some unusual dynamics with his body, his wingspan, how he takes up oxygen. Simone Biles is only able to do many of the like patented, like literally she only can do some of these twists and turns because of her stature and her strength, like the ratio of her muscle to like her stature. And so the concept of advantage is confusing to me, especially when it comes to most of the time these conversations are about children's sports. So my question is always, what is the purpose of a child participating in a sport? Like, is it about winning at all costs? Or is it about character building and community and like exercise? So those are some of my thoughts. And I'm going to post kind of a resource that I liked. It's a Facebook post, but it has several links within it that I have found helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's complex in that, they're still doing research on that topic. Is there an advantage or not? And the research hasn't really panned out that there is one. In fact, if you look at data from trans athletes who have, advanced to, nationals or even almost Olympic level, and find that, the advantages that people are trying to claim that exist really don't exist, and what typically happens, or what's typically talked about in this context, are those who are assigned male at birth, who have gone into transitioning to be trans femme, competing with other women, and this concept of, those who grew up as in male bodies, they have more muscles, and then therefore they have more advantage. But that isn't necessarily the case, because when one starts medical transition, muscle mass decreases. And so that becomes an issue when it comes to any form of athletics. In fact, if you look at the times for, gosh, I forgot her name, but there's a prominent swimmer who competed in swimming before transition and after transition. And if you analyze their best times, it actually went down after transition. And it went down, but it was also lower than the max, or not the max, but the records given by cis athletes in the same field. So I think the concept of this advantage is happening, et cetera, is there's not enough data to be based on it. And those who I see are complaining about that don't really understand that. Don't understand that the research is very complicated, and one has to really truly understand what they're talking about when there's just not that much of this happening to really know. And it's funny too, because when this pops up, and I speak to other trans folks about this. She's like, wow, we have an advantage in sports, really? Like that? Why didn't anyone tell me about this? Let me go compete right now. And it's I've not been athletic a day in my life without trying to be, but yeah, that's I feel like a lot of it's more just fear of trans people than actually like fairness for their kids or for their athletes.
One last thing that I would add that is in that Facebook post I just put in the chat is just like when we were talking about honorifics yesterday, and that the Ms. honorific, people said it's the downfall of society, it's going to destroy the fabric of the family if women don't want to be associated with their husbands, and etc. That post goes into some of the history of when women first started to compete in sports, that there was so much fear about, well, can a woman still be a woman if she's athletic? And what will this do to childbearing? Will women be women anymore? And so I think that it's important from a spiritual perspective for me. I feel like there's some archetypal angst that can come up at these moments in history where it's like we repeat the same fears about, I think gender is such an important category for so many people when they think about humanity, and that anytime there's some kind of like different role or expression for people based on gender, that we get really afraid that somehow our society will be the worse for it. So that is comforting, at least to me, because it's not as if the fear is invalid, right? Because feelings are just feelings, but it's more about like, how are we shaped in a way that makes us afraid and that makes us think somehow our opportunities or our freedom or fairness or something is going to change for us or our loved ones. We've got about 4 minutes left. Are there any last thoughts, anything that Kevin or Cal, you want to share or clarify?
So there's a question that came up about, can you say something about how to handle bathroom spaces in a way that protects everyone? And which I think is a really important question. So, in terms of specific things to do in a bathroom, aside from washing your hands, I really don't know. But from a systems standpoint, I think it's important to, if you're in a position to encourage organizations to have more all gender restrooms. For instance, the hospital where I work, we after a lot of arm pulling and poking and prodding, convinced the hospital to convert all restrooms into all gender restrooms, with a few exceptions of kind of large restrooms that are available. And then, and we're in New York State, so there isn't a law or anything that requires folks to use the restroom that's on their birth certificate or et cetera, et cetera. But I think when it comes to advocating about that in a system standpoint, that's very, very important. And another thing too is if you notice elements of resistance or harassment in a bathroom, I guess it can be understated how appreciative we get when cis people intervene and say, look, this is not right, instead of being silent, because that's part of using your privilege for good. And this is one of the situations in which that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to echo what Kevin has said, and just also address that, especially working in schools, what I see the pushback being, and I'll be perfectly frank and upfront here, is that is a transphobic sentiment, which believes that trans women are men, and that they don't want men to be preying on women in private spaces. And the reality is that trans people just want to use the restroom safely, and yes, we have the world has problems with safety and women and protecting women. And I would like to include trans women in that. We need to keep women safe. And so I think that continuing to work on rape culture and protecting people, protecting women is important for all of these issues. But I think really just being honest with the fact that that people are just trying to use the restroom, and not having all gender restroom spaces often creates health issues for all people, especially young people. So one thing that we see is young people who will not go to the bathroom all day long because they are afraid of facing harassment in the restrooms. And that is very, very, very common as trans and gender nonconforming people. And that results in UTIs, kidney issues, all sorts of things. So that's my 2 cents there is I would add, yes, please neutralize the restrooms. Also, I would say one of the perks is that it helps keep them cleaner because people don't like to be messy in front of each other. That's what I've seen.
And we're going to end right there. Thank you so much, Cal and Kevin. I really appreciate you taking the time out. There is an after chat. Unfortunately, I can't join today because we've got media stuff going on. But you can be in touch. So we put Salon Benders in the chat. So Kevin and Cal, if you want to put any contact info or any resources or anything to follow up with you, go ahead and do that in the chat. And thank you for this opportunity, Jim, and everybody at Humanity Rising.
Thank you, Kelsey and Kevin and Cal. This has been amazing. And I want to just pay a special tribute to you, Kelsey. You know, over the last 3 days, you've enabled many of us to go from monochrome, I would say, to technicolor on the issue of gender and sexuality and the exuberance of the human spirit as it's now under world conditions of all kinds redefines itself at the most fundamental level of gender and sexuality. And you've done a masterful job. I just want to say, as the convener of Humanity Rising from the beginning, this program has been one of the best that we've had. So I just want to salute you and thank you and Kevin and Cal today for an incredibly thoughtful and nuanced discussion about an issue that terrifies a significant portion of the population, but excites and animates other parts of the population. And that's predictable. Anytime there's been an innovation that comes into human social reality, it kind of splits the psyche in some way. And it's only over time, as people become accustomed to it and habituated to the new patterns, that what seemed heretical, a generation ago, is now just normal. And people say, what's the big deal? But it takes courage and deep authenticity, as you have all demonstrated in your stories, to be among those early adopters, those mavericks and heretics that open up the possibility of the future. So I just want to acknowledge that. We support you at Humanity Rising. I am delighted to know, I didn't know this, that this is Pan Gender Day, and also the day that you're launching the next iteration of trans body, trans selves. So I want to recommend that to everyone. So thank you. Thank you. You've done a great service. It's always good to go from monochrome to technicolor and high definition reality. So thank you. You're all welcome to the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box that Stan has put in. Interestingly enough, tomorrow we're going to have a discussion about religious trauma syndrome. It's the religious trauma that many of us experience in our youth as children and early adults that contributes to a large degree to the gender, sexual identity, racial, social, personal confusions and dysfunctions that many people experience. So we're going to be talking with a woman who grew up as a missionary kid in Taiwan, who struggled her way out of a religious trauma, even as you have struggled your way out of gender and sexual trauma and constraints. And I think that's a good place to end, that the struggle of any of us in any sector is really the struggle of all of us in any of the situations in which we have to move from slavery to freedom, from constriction to abundance, from a sense of fear and low self-esteem because of various factors in our lives, to a more authentic, courageous, abundant existence. So I want to express, as we close, really the solidarity of all of us, whether we're fighting for freedom in Ukraine or we're fighting for the freedom of gender expression in San Mateo, California. The struggle for human liberation, in the end, is all one. So thank you, all of you, for this. And I'll bring this now to a close. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now. Great session. Great session.